Entire cities supposedly buried under 10 feet of mud. Buildings with their first floors suddenly underground. Doorways opening into basements. Hundreds of photographs from the 1800s show crews digging around windows that should have been above ground. The mud flood theory claims that sometime in the 1800s, a catastrophic event buried cities across the world under layers of sediment. Proponents point to old buildings with basement windows at street level, buried archways, and photographs showing excavation work in major cities. But here's the question. No one in the mud flood community seems to answer. If a flood of mud buried entire cities, where did all that mud actually come from? This is not a rhetorical question. It's a physics problem. And when you do the math, the entire theory collapses. Most people hear about the mud flood and immediately ask if it happened. But that's the wrong question. The right question is, could it have happened? Because if you can't explain where thousands of cubic miles of mud materialize from, you don't have a theory. You have a fantasy. Consider what it would actually take to bury a city. San Francisco covers about 47 square miles. To bury it under 10 feet of mud, you'd need roughly 2,440,000,000 cubic feet of sediment. That's not an abstract number. That's actual dirt that has to come from somewhere, travel to the city, and settle uniformly across every street, every building, every hillside. Now scale that to every major city supposedly buried. New York, London, Paris, Moscow, Chicago, Boston. The mud flood theory claims this happened globally, all around the same time. We're talking about trillions of cubic feet of mud appearing out of nowhere and settling perfectly across the world. Mud doesn't just appear, it comes from erosion, which is a slow process, or from catastrophic flooding, which requires a source. Let's examine both options. Erosion takes time. The Mississippi River, one of the largest river systems in North America, moves about 500 million tons of sediment per year. That sounds like a lot until you realize that's accumulated over its entire drainage basin, which covers 1,200,000 square miles. And that sediment doesn't pile up in cities. It flows downstream and deposits in deltas and floodplains. To generate enough mud to bury even one major city would require either stripping topsoil from an area hundreds of times larger than the city itself, or some event pulverizing and suspending vast amounts of earth all at once. Both scenarios have problems. If you strip topsoil from surrounding regions, you'd see evidence: massive erosion scars, landscapes scraped down to bedrock. Photographs from the 1800s and early 1900s would show barren wastelands surrounding every major city. But we don't see that. We see forests, farmland, and natural terrain consistent with normal geological processes. Perhaps it was a flood, not slow erosion, but a sudden catastrophic event dumping sediment across cities. Proponents point to tsunamis or megafloods, but those don't work either. Tsunamis are caused by underwater earthquakes or landslides. They move water, not mud. When a tsunami hits land, it brings seawater inland, maybe some coastal sediment, but not thick, uniform mud layers that bury buildings. Tsunamis destroy with force and speed. They knock things down. They don't gently bury 10 feet of dirt. The 2011 Tohoku tsunami in Japan devastated coastal cities, but it didn't bury them. It scattered debris, left a thin layer of sand and silt in some areas. Nothing close to uniform citywide burial, as described by mud flood proponents. Then there's the issue of water source. A flood big enough to carry that much sediment would need an enormous body of water. Where would it come from? The oceans didn't rise and fall by hundreds of feet in the 1800s. Tidal records, coastal measurements, and geological evidence would show something that dramatic. Ships at sea reported nothing unusual. Some suggest underground reservoirs or liquefaction events. But liquefaction only happens during earthquakes, affects localized areas, and doesn't create new mud. It simply rearranges what's already there. Now let's look at what we actually see in those old photographs. Yes, there are images of streets being raised, buildings with basement-level windows at ground level, and crews excavating around old structures. but every single one of those images has a documented explanation that doesn't require a global catastrophe. Cities raised their street levels intentionally. Chicago did it in the 1850s and 1860s to improve drainage and install sewer systems. Large sections of the city were physically lifted using jacks, while new foundations were built underneath. Seattle did the same after a fire in 1889 destroyed much of downtown. The city rebuilt at a higher elevation to prevent flooding, which left old ground floors below the new street level. This wasn't unusual. It was standard urban planning in the 19th century. Cities built on low-lying ground or near rivers frequently dealt with flooding and poor drainage. Raising street levels was the solution. It's well documented with city records, engineering reports, and contemporary newspaper accounts describing the process. When you see a photo of workers digging around an old building, you're often looking at infrastructure projects, installing water lines, sewer systems, gas lines, electrical conduits. Cities were being modernized, and that required excavation. The idea that every construction crew in every photo was uncovering a buried city is simply not supported by the records from that time. Here's another problem with the mud flood narrative. Buildings don't survive burial the way proponents claim. If a structure gets buried under 10 feet of sediment, especially wet sediment, it experiences enormous pressure. Wooden buildings collapse. Brick and stone buildings crack and shift. Foundations fail. You wouldn't end up with perfectly preserved buildings just waiting to be dug out. You'd end up with rubble. Real-world examples show what happens when mud buries structures. The 1985 Armero tragedy in Colombia saw a volcanic mud flow bury the town under several meters of debris. The buildings didn't survive intact. They were heavily damaged, displaced, and partially collapsed. That's what mud does when it moves with enough force to travel and bury things. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that some fine, water-saturated sediment could bury a city gently enough to leave buildings intact. Where did that sediment come from? And why don't we see the source? Sediment doesn't just appear. If enough dirt was stripped from one area to bury multiple cities, we'd see massive geological scars. River valleys carved down to bedrock, hillsides completely eroded, plains scraped flat. We'd see that sediment's journey, massive deposits between the source and the cities, layers of mud in places that don't make sense. We don't see any of that. The geological record shows normal gradual sedimentation patterns, river deltas where they should be, glacial deposits from the Ice Age in regions where glaciers actually existed, volcanic ash layers corresponding to known eruptions. Everything matches long-term geological processes, not a sudden global mud catastrophe in the 1800s. Then there's the timing. Mud flood proponents claim this happened in the early to mid-1800s, sometimes as late as the 1850s or 1860s. That period is rich with written records, newspapers, government documents, personal diaries, and international communication. If a global catastrophe buried cities, we'd have thousands of first-hand accounts describing it. We'd have diplomatic correspondence, scientific investigations. We have none of that. What we have are normal historical records describing urban development, infrastructure projects, fires, floods, and the gradual evolution of cities. There's no gap in the record, no mysterious event that everyone somehow forgot to write about. Some proponents argue that the records were suppressed or altered, but that raises more questions than it answers. Who suppressed them? How did they coordinate across dozens of countries with different governments, languages, and political systems? Why would they suppress evidence of a natural disaster? And how did they manage to alter not just official records but also private letters, diaries, photographs, and the memories of millions of people? The scale of conspiracy required to pull that off is absurd. You'd need to control every newspaper, every government archive, every personal correspondence, and every photograph from that era, and do it perfectly, leaving no trace of the cover-up. That's not how information works. Secrets leak, documents survive, people talk. Let's examine one specific claim often repeated. Proponents say Old World architecture shows evidence of a more advanced civilization that was buried and partially excavated. They point to ornate buildings, large public structures, intricate stonework, as proof that the 1800s society couldn't have built them. But we have actual records of these buildings being constructed: architectural plans, construction contracts, worker payrolls, material invoices. We have photos of buildings under construction. We have the names of the architects and firms that built them. The Chicago World's Fair buildings from 1893, for example, are extensively documented from design through construction to demolition. There's no mystery there. The craftsmanship isn't evidence of a lost civilization. It's evidence that 19th century architects, engineers, and laborers were skilled and took pride in their work. Here's what actually explains the things mud flood proponents point to. Cities evolve. Streets get raised for drainage and infrastructure. Basements become ground floor spaces when street levels change. Old buildings get renovated, entrances modified. None of that requires a catastrophe. It's normal urban development over time. Photographs showing excavation aren't uncovering a buried city. They show construction, renovation, and infrastructure work. Installing a sewer system, building a subway, adding a basement all require digging. That's not a lost world. That's construction. Yes, some buildings have features that seem odd today: windows below street level, doorways opening into sunken areas. But those features made sense when constructed. Perhaps the street was lower then. Perhaps the entrance was designed for a purpose. Context matters. Looking at the history of individual buildings, explanations are straightforward. The mud flood theory also ignores basic hydrology. Mud doesn't flow uphill. It doesn't settle uniformly across varied terrain. If a massive mud flow hit a city on hills like San Francisco, sediment would pile in valleys, leaving high ground relatively clear. You wouldn't see every building buried under the same depth of mud. That's not how gravity works. Real mud flows follow topography, downhill, accumulating in depressions, leaving higher areas exposed. The 2014 OSO mudslide in Washington state is an example. Debris followed the terrain, burying the valley floor, leaving higher ground untouched. A city bearing mud flow would reflect the landscape, not a uniform blanket coverage. Let's do the math. A 10-foot layer across a city requires an enormous amount of suspended sediment. Water can only carry so much before it stops being water and becomes debris or a mudslide. Debris flows are dense, viscous, and incredibly destructive. They demolish, not gently bury. The viscosity depends on water-to-sediment ratio. Too much water, sediment settles quickly, leaving little deposit. Too little water, you get a slow, dense slurry that wouldn't spread across an entire city before solidifying. There's no middle ground for a fast-moving flow that leaves buildings intact. And the aftermath? When mud dries, it shrinks, cracks, and destabilizes. Buildings partially buried in drying mud shift settle unevenly. Foundations crack, walls collapse. We'd see that damage in old buildings if a mud burial had occurred. But we don't. What we see instead is normal wear, damage from known events like fires and earthquakes, and aging materials. Nothing suggests buildings were buried under tons of wet sediment and dug out. The economic history angle is telling. The 1800s were a period of massive urbanization and industrialization. Cities grew rapidly. Railways were built, telegraph lines erected, factories opened, trade expanded. All required workers, materials, infrastructure. Detailed records exist. Trade logs, tax records, census data, employment figures. If a catastrophe buried cities, we'd see massive disruption to trade, population loss, labor shortages, economic collapse. None of that appears. Instead, records show consistent growth with occasional downturns due to financial panics, wars, and epidemics. The data doesn't support a global catastrophe. It supports normal development. Some proponents suggest the mud flood targeted specific buildings, particularly older ornate structures. They claim these buildings survived from a previous civilization. But Victorian architecture was ornate by design, valuing decoration, craftsmanship, and visible displays of wealth. Buildings from that era featured detailed stonework and elaborate facades because that's what people wanted. Architectural styles traceable through the 1800s include Greek Revival in the early decades, Gothic Revival mid-century, Romanesque Revival, Queen Anne, Beaux-Arts. Each style has documented origins and example buildings that can be dated precisely through construction records. Now, the claim that historical records were altered or suppressed is implausible. Suppressing evidence of a global catastrophe would require cooperation across nations often at war with each other. The 1800s saw the Napoleonic Wars, the Crimean War, the American Civil War, the Franco-Russian War. Nations that couldn't agree on borders would need to agree on a comprehensive cover-up. You'd need to control government archives, private collections, newspapers, scientific societies, and personal correspondence across languages and political systems. You'd need to alter photographs and forge documents in dozens of languages before the age of fast communication. Logistically, it's impossible. More importantly, why? Natural disasters allow governments to demonstrate competence through relief and rebuilding. There's no reason every government would want to hide a catastrophe that wasn't their fault. The conspiracy also requires millions of ordinary people to forget a life-changing event, people who lost homes and loved ones. Collective amnesia on that scale doesn't happen. Memories persist. Oral histories survive. Family histories from the 1800s, diaries, letters, photographs, heirlooms, preserving stories of immigration, wars, personal tragedies, all show normal 19th century experiences. They contain no reference to a civilization-ending catastrophe. Technology arguments fall apart too. Some proponents claim buildings show construction techniques more advanced than the 1800s possessed. Large stone blocks, sophisticated plumbing, electrical systems. But the 1800s were incredibly innovative. Steam power, telegraphs, photography, concrete, steel beams, elevators. Engineers built massive bridges, dug long tunnels, constructed buildings that still stand today. The Brooklyn Bridge, completed in 1883, used steel cables and pneumatic caissons. The Eiffel Tower, finished in 1889, was an engineering marvel. The Crystal Palace in London, built for the 1851 Great Exhibition, used prefabricated cast iron and glass at unprecedented scale. Sophisticated construction from the 1800s reflects the knowledge, physics, mathematics, and material science of the time. Skilled engineers documented their methods. Pattern recognition drives mud flood belief. Humans see patterns even when none exist. Dozens of construction site photos look similar. Your brain connects them into a narrative. But correlation isn't causation. Similarity isn't proof of a shared origin. Photos show construction projects spanning decades in different cities. Sewer installations, street work, building foundations, subway excavations. They look similar because excavation looks similar, not because they're uncovering the same buried civilization. The mud flood theory fails at every level. Geologically, there's no source for the mud. Physically, deposits would differ and buildings wouldn't survive intact. Historically, no contemporary accounts exist, and the documented record explains everything. Economically, no disruption appears. Technologically, 19th century engineering was capable of everything seen. What remains is a misunderstanding. Cities develop, geology follows physics, historical evidence should be evaluated contextually. The mud flood theory isn't alternative history. It's a misreading of actual history, built on fragments taken out of context, assembled into a narrative that collapses under scrutiny. Cities change. They grow, adapt, rebuild, evolve. Traces of that evolution are everywhere if you know what to look for. Raised streets, modified buildings, layered infrastructure, all documented, all explainable, all normal. The real history is fascinating and complex. It doesn't require catastrophes to be interesting. Streets get raised, basements added, buildings renovated, infrastructure installed. That's what cities do. The records exist. The explanations are clear. The mud flood didn't happen because it couldn't have. Where did all the mud come from? It didn't. It was just cities doing what cities have always done, changing over time. Thank you for listening. Comment, like, and subscribe if you found this helpful or want to share your thoughts.